A black pilot was finally heading home after 3 back-to-back international flights. Ready to sink into the comfort of his first-class seat. But the moment he stepped onto the plane, everything changed. A flight attendant, without even glancing at his ticket, blocked his path, suggesting that economy might be more appropriate. What happened next didn't just shock the passengers. It sparked a chain of events that no one on that flight could have predicted. Stay with me because this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, take a second to comment below where you're watching from. If stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more. Now, let's get into it. At first, it was just another day in the air. The pilot, let's call him Marcus, was off duty, dressed in plain clothes, and looking forward to a quiet flight home. But as he approached first class, the flight attendant stepped in front of him. Her eyes lingered a second too long on him, scanning not his ticket, but him. "Sir, I believe this section is for first-class passengers only," she said, her tone sharp but polite. Too polite. Marcus smiled, pulling out his boarding pass. "I know, seat 3A. But that wasn't enough." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Perhaps there's been a mix-up. Let me check with the gate agent." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched closely, whispering behind their hands. Marcus could feel it. The weight of their gazes pressing down on him. Minutes passed. The attendant returned, visibly flustered but holding firm. "It seems there's no error. But perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the economy." Marcus had been here before. Many times. But what happened next? The captain, who just so happened to know exactly who Marcus was, stepped out of the cockpit. With a calm, commanding voice, he addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we take off, I'd like to personally introduce one of the most experienced pilots at this airline. Captain Marcus Evans, who just completed a transatlantic flight. If anyone deserves first class, it's him." Silence fell over the cabin. The whispers stopped. The tension shattered like glass. And Marcus? He didn't need to say a word. Because sometimes, the truth speaks for itself. The station hummed with the slow rhythm of early morning travelers. James Carter stood by the platform, the weight of his duffel bag anchoring him to the cold tile beneath his feet. The sun had yet to fully rise, casting long shadows that stretched across the tracks like unanswered questions. James was used to the stillness of these in-between hours. The moments where cities whispered awake but hadn't yet gathered the courage to shout. He had returned from deployment a week ago. But the homecoming felt less like a celebration and more like slipping quietly into a place that hadn't noticed his absence. His uniform drew eyes, but not the kind that saluted. It was the glance held half a second too long. The soft narrowing of lids as if to confirm that what they saw wasn't out of place. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if James didn't know the language. But he did. He'd grown fluent in it by 16. The train arrived with a shudder, hissing at the seams as doors slid open. James stepped inside, moving toward the rows of empty seats. But before he could settle in, the conductor's voice rang out behind him. "Sir, those seats are reserved for priority passengers." James turned, the words hanging between them. The man, a middle-aged conductor with silver-rimmed glasses, adjusted his hat. Eyes fixed somewhere near James's shoulder. "I'm priority," James replied, voice even but not loud. The conductor hesitated, and in that pause, the entire carriage felt it. A woman clutched her purse closer. A man by the window folded his newspaper but didn't look up. "Let me see your ticket." James exhaled slowly, drawing the paper from his coat pocket, unfolding it with careful hands. The conductor scanned it once, then twice, as if the ink might rearrange itself. Finally, he stepped aside. "Apologies. Enjoy your ride." James slid into his seat by the window, the outside world blurring into streaks of light as the train eased forward. But the apology lingered like smoke. Not for the mistake. No. It was for the inconvenience of having to correct it. And James knew this was just the beginning. The city greeted James with indifference. The streets stretched out ahead of him like an old map he could no longer read. Familiar but distant, buildings he had known since childhood now seemed taller, as if standing on their toes to avoid recognition. James walked with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to moving through spaces that were not always his. He had worn that posture in uniform. But here, in civilian clothes, it felt heavier. He stepped into the corner diner where he used to eat before his deployment. The bell above the door chimed softly. But no one looked up. The place hadn't changed much. The same cracked vinyl booths. The same old jukebox leaning in the corner like an elderly man unwilling to leave. James slid into a booth by the window. The waitress approached, pen poised over a notepad. "Coffee and eggs?" she asked without meeting his eyes. "That's right," James said. She nodded and walked away, her steps quick and deliberate. Outside, the morning light had fully claimed the streets. A man in a dark suit paced along the sidewalk, his phone pressed to his ear. Across the street, a young mother pulled her child closer as they passed a group of teenagers laughing too loudly. James turned his attention back inside as the waitress returned with his coffee. She placed it on the table, careful not to let their hands brush. "Are you back in town for good?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting him. "For now," James replied. She nodded again, but the conversation didn't linger. There was nothing unkind in her manner. But James recognized the space she left between them. As he sipped his coffee, the diner's door opened, and a group of construction workers entered, their laughter filling the room. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with grease-streaked hands, caught sight of James and hesitated for half a beat. "You served?" the man asked, sliding into the booth next to him without invitation. "I did." The man nodded, approving but cautious. "Army?" "Marines," James said. The man's expression flickered, and James knew what was coming. "Hell of a thing. Appreciate your service," the man said, lifting his cup in a mock salute. James forced a small smile. "Thank you." The man leaned in slightly. "You know, I always say it takes a certain kind of grit to serve. Lot of folks wouldn't understand." James understood exactly what the man meant. And for a moment, he considered letting it pass. But something about the way the man's gaze lingered told him this was not a kindness. It was a test. "It's not about grit," James said evenly. "It's about doing the job. Same as anyone else." The man's smile thinned. "Sure, still, a different world out there. Isn't it?" James set his cup down carefully, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "Not as different as you'd think." The man's laughter came quick and shallow. He clapped James on the shoulder a little too hard and rose to join his friends at the counter. James watched him go, feeling the slight shift in the air that followed the exchange. The waitress returned with his plate. But this time, she left it at the edge of the table, far enough that James had to reach for it. It was always the small things, James thought, the almost invisible movements that built walls brick by brick. And as he finished his meal, he realized the weight of those small things was growing heavier by the day. It began, as these things often do, with something that could be dismissed, explained away as misunderstanding, coincidence, or simple miscommunication, the kind of thing that, when repeated to others, left James wondering if he had imagined the slight. The grocery store on Lincoln Avenue was one he had visited since childhood. Back when his mother pressed a few crumpled bills into his hand and trusted him to return with milk and bread. The aisles felt smaller now, the shelves taller, or maybe James had grown too accustomed to wide open spaces and desert skies. He moved carefully through the store, taking his time, letting the normalcy of the task settle into his bones. The low hum of refrigeration units and the quiet chatter of other shoppers filled the space around him. At the checkout line, a middle-aged woman stood in front of him, fussing with her coupons. The cashier, a young man with the look of someone bored but diligent, nodded along politely, scanning items one by one. James set his few groceries on the conveyor belt behind her, waiting with the patience of someone who had stood in longer lines under harsher suns. But then the man behind him arrived. James felt at first the brief hesitation of the cashier's gaze, flicking toward the man before returning to the task at hand. When the woman finished and James stepped forward, the cashier's demeanor shifted, his polite professionalism replaced with something cooler. "You find everything okay?" the cashier asked without looking up. "I did." James handed him the carton of eggs and loaf of bread. There was a pause, slight but noticeable. Paper or plastic? Paper, fine. The man behind James shuffled closer. And the movement was enough to press against James's patience. You got another line open? The man asked the cashier, though his eyes were fixed on James. James said nothing. The cashier glanced over his shoulder. Lane 6 is open if you... I'm good. The man interrupted, settling in just a little too close. Just seems like we're moving kind of slow up here. James heard the shift in the man's voice. The slight curl of insinuation beneath his words. He had heard it too many times to miss it now. I'm sure he's doing his best, James said quietly. The cashier's eyes flicked between them. And for a moment, the world seemed to shrink around that one small exchange. The man grunted. I wasn't talking to you. James met his gaze, holding it steady. I know. The silence that followed seemed to stretch out longer than the few seconds it occupied. When the cashier handed James his receipt, their fingers didn't touch. James took his bag and walked toward the exit. But he felt the man's stare like heat on the back of his neck. The glass door slid open with a soft hiss, and the cold air of the outside world met him. But the weight of the moment lingered. It would be easy to call it nothing. To tell himself the man had been impatient. The cashier distracted. But James knew better. The thing about fire is that it rarely announces itself with flames. Most times, it begins with the quiet burn of embers beneath the surface. And James could feel the heat rising. James had never thought much about doors. Not the grand ones. The ones that swung open with the weight of history or power. Those, he understood, were meant to be heavy. They demanded something from the person passing through. But it was the small doors, the ones people barely noticed, that seemed to gather weight over time. The bank door was one of those. It was a Tuesday afternoon. And the line was short. Mostly elderly folks cashing checks or making deposits. James stood near the back, hands in his pockets, waiting. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning products. The teller called the next person forward. James glanced down at his watch. He wasn't in a rush. But there was something about standing still that unsettled him. Movement felt safer. Ahead of him, an older white woman, frail and bent at the shoulders, shuffled forward with her cane tapping softly against the floor. James smiled to himself, recognizing her from church services he attended with his mother. Her voice trembled as she spoke to the teller. I'm just making a deposit. Sweetheart. The teller, a young woman with tired eyes, nodded and began counting the bills the woman had placed on the counter. James shifted his weight and let his eyes drift around the room. That's when he noticed the manager, a tall man in a pressed gray suit, watching him from the far side of the room. At first, James thought nothing of it. But the glance lingered. James had seen that look before. It was the look of someone quietly recalculating, recategorizing. The manager said nothing, only stepping slightly closer to the teller station, as if his presence might be required. James tightened his grip on the deposit slip in his hand. The older woman finished her transaction and turned slowly. James stepped aside to let her pass. Good afternoon, Mrs. Jacobs, he said softly, tipping his head. She squinted up at him, smiling faintly. James, isn't it? Your mother sings in the choir. Yes, ma'am. She must be proud of you, Mrs. Jacobs said, patting his arm with the soft fragility of someone who had long since made peace with the world. James waited until she was clear before approaching the counter. The teller glanced at him with polite indifference, her eyes drifting to the manager who had taken up post a few feet away. Deposit? She asked. Yes. James slid the slip across the counter along with a worn leather wallet. And I need to withdraw $200 from my checking. The teller hesitated, barely noticeable, before nodding and beginning the process. The manager was close enough now that James could hear the creak of his shoes against the tile. James didn't look at him. A second teller, a young white man, appeared from the back and settled into the station beside them. His presence was casual, but James could see it for what it was. A reinforcement. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. James said nothing. Finally, the teller pushed the stack of bills toward him. Anything else today, Mr. Carter? James paused, folding the bills with slow precision. No, he said finally. That'll do. He slipped the money into his wallet. took his receipt, and stepped away from the counter. The manager watched him all the way to the door. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. But James barely felt the warmth. The glass of the bank reflected his own image back at him, fractured by the faint letters etched into the door "We're here to help." James smiled, but there was no humor in it. He knew, of course, that no one would speak of it. There would be no complaint filed. No overt accusation. It was the kind of thing that lived in the pauses. The subtle tightening of smiles. The quiet presence of second tellers. It was the weight of small doors. And James felt it every time he stepped through. James had always believed that people revealed themselves in moments of inconvenience. It wasn't during grand gestures or public speeches. No, the truth slipped out in the quiet spaces, when patience wore thin. And the masks people wore started to slip. The convenience store was nearly empty when James entered that evening. The air inside was heavy with the faint smell of old coffee and floor wax. The kind of smell that never fully leaves a place no matter how many times it's cleaned. He was here for something simple: a pack of batteries for the smoke alarm that wouldn't stop beeping. A small, necessary errand. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as James stepped inside. A young man, probably no older than 20, was slouched behind the register, tapping away at his phone. James moved down the aisle, his footsteps soft against the linoleum. The store was silent except for the faint hum of a freezer unit somewhere in the back. There was an older woman near the front, peering over a rack of magazines, and a white man in a crisp blue jacket pacing by the cooler, his phone pressed to his ear. James found the batteries near the back wall, next to a stack of discounted candy bars. He grabbed a pack and turned toward the register. That's when he saw it. The clerk, who had barely acknowledged James, was standing upright now, his eyes fixed on him with the quiet intensity James knew all too well. It wasn't the look of suspicion. Not yet. It was the beginning of something. A little room for doubt. James kept his expression calm, moving at the same steady pace. But he could feel the shift in the air, the way the young clerk's body tensed slightly, his fingers brushing the counter like he was readying himself. The man in the blue jacket was still pacing, his voice sharp as he argued about something James couldn't quite catch. When James reached the counter, the clerk glanced down at the batteries, scanning them with one quick motion. That all? James nodded. That's all. The clerk's eyes flickered, just for a moment. To the pockets of James's coat. James didn't react. He simply pulled out his wallet, sliding a bill across the counter. The clerk hesitated before taking it. James knew what was happening. He'd seen it before. The tiny calculation, the risk assessment unfolding in the boy's head. But there was no confrontation, no accusation, just a lingering pause. James took his change and started toward the door. That's when the man in the blue jacket spoke up, his voice cutting through the silence. Hey, hold up a second. James stopped. He turned slowly, careful to keep his expression neutral. The man was watching him now, his phone still in hand. But his eyes had narrowed. Are you sure you didn't forget something? James felt the weight of the question, heavy and familiar. He smiled, just a small, polite curve of his lips. I'm sure. The man didn't move, his gaze fixed, waiting. The silence stretched long enough that even the older woman near the magazines glanced up, her eyes darting nervously between them. James held the man's gaze for a few seconds longer, then nodded politely. Good night. He stepped outside, the cold air striking him harder than he expected. The door closed behind him with a dull chime, but the echo of the man's voice lingered. James didn't rush to his car. Instead, he stood near the edge of the sidewalk, letting the quiet settle around him. He could see his reflection faintly in the store's window, just a shadow framed by the flickering neon sign overhead. In another time, he might have let the moment pass, dismiss it as another small incident, another subtle reminder of the boundaries people carried with them. But James wasn't so sure anymore. He could feel something gathering, something he wasn't certain how to name. A little room for doubt. And maybe that was the beginning of everything. James hadn't expected much from the neighborhood meeting. It was held in the basement of a nearby church, the kind of room that smelled faintly of old hymn books and damp carpet. Metal folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows, and a table of stale pastries sat in the corner beneath a weak overhead light. He arrived early and sat near the back, hands resting in his lap. He had learned long ago that in rooms like these, his presence was often enough to tilt the air. The others filtered in slowly. Men in sweaters, women in modest coats, most of them older, their movements slow but steady, carrying the quiet weight of people who had lived in this neighborhood long before James moved in. They exchanged polite nods as they entered. A few glanced his way, offered hesitant smiles, but James could feel the hesitation beneath it, the subtle pause in their recognition. He wasn't new to them. He had lived here for 5 years, long enough to remember which house needed a new coat of paint and which couple walked their dog every morning at 7. But there were some distances that didn't shorten with time. As the meeting began, the discussion fell into its usual rhythm: concerns about potholes, streetlights that needed fixing, and the occasional complaint about noise from the corner bar. James listened, contributing little. It wasn't until the topic shifted to safety that he felt the change. A woman near the front, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, spoke first. "I've noticed more unfamiliar cars lately," she said. "Some of them park near the playground at night." Another man chimed in, nodding solemnly. "Same here. Last week, I saw a group of boys hanging around the liquor store. They weren't from here." James's gaze didn't waver, but inside, he could feel the familiar tension start to rise. They weren't from here. It was a small phrase, harmless on the surface, but James had come to recognize the weight of those words. The way they could carry the shape of someone's skin, the texture of their hair. A few others murmured in agreement. "Maybe we should think about starting a neighborhood watch," the gray-haired woman added. "Just to be safe." James let the silence stretch, watching as heads slowly nodded around him. It was subtle, the way these conversations unfolded. Not loud, not angry, just be careful, measured. The real trouble wasn't in what was said. It was in what wasn't. James shifted in his chair, his voice calm but deliberate. "I take my walks late sometimes," he said, his tone even. "I've noticed a few cars myself. But it's hard to say if they belong or not. Isn't it?" His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, no one responded. The woman in the front turned slightly, offering him a tight smile. "Of course, James. I wasn't talking about you." Her answer was smooth, practiced, but James could hear what she wasn't saying. "Not you, but people like you." He nodded slowly, folding his hands together. "I understand," he replied. The meeting continued, the conversation shifting to less delicate matters: trash collection, plans for a summer festival. But James knew the divide hadn't disappeared. It had only grown quieter, slipping beneath the surface where it was harder to see but no less present. As the meeting adjourned, James rose with the others, shaking hands and exchanging brief farewells. But as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he carried their words with him. Some distances, he thought, didn't shorten with time. They stretched, quietly, beneath every handshake, every polite nod. And yet, James kept walking, his footsteps soft against the pavement because even if the distance lingered, he refused to let it stop him. It was a week after the neighborhood meeting when James saw the first sign. A laminated flyer, taped to the community board outside the grocery store. Bold red letters at the top read, "Watchful neighbors, protecting our community." Below it, a list of suspicious activity followed, carefully worded but transparent enough for James to see the outlines of something else beneath the ink. He stood there for a long moment, reading the list twice over. Nowhere on the flyer did it mention race. It didn't have to. The phrases did enough work on their own. Individuals loitering near residential areas, strangers walking without apparent destination, unrecognized vehicles parked for extended periods. James exhaled softly, stepping back to take in the sight. A woman passing by glanced at him, her eyes flickering to the flyer and then quickly away, as if proximity to it made the air heavier. He had half a mind to pull it down, to crumple it into his jacket pocket and let it disappear like fallen leaves underfoot. But he didn't. He left it there, untouched. Because the flyer wasn't just paper. It was a mirror. That evening, James took his usual walk. It was a route he had followed for years, a quiet loop through his neighborhood. Past the church on 5th Street, cutting through the small park with the rusted benches. But that night felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the flyer still clinging to his mind. Or maybe it was something else. An instinct that sharpened at the edges of his awareness. The houses felt quieter, lights glowed in windows, but behind them, James imagined faces peering out through curtains. Eyes narrowed in a way they hadn't been before. Halfway through his route, he saw them. 2 men standing near the park entrance. Their hands stuffed into coat pockets. Speaking in low voices. James didn't recognize them. And for a brief, unsettling moment, he felt the reflex take hold. The urge to glance twice. To linger longer than necessary. It passed quickly, but the shame of it lingered. Hadn't the flyer done its work after all? He kept walking. As he approached the park, the men grew quiet. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in a worn cap, turned to watch him pass. "Evening," James said, his voice steady. The man nodded, but there was something guarded in his posture. Something James couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. James kept walking, feeling their eyes at his back long after he had left the park behind. Later that night, James sat at his kitchen table with the lights dimmed. The flyer sat in front of him now, retrieved from the community board on his way home. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, worn soft from handling. There was a time, he thought, when words like these would have driven him to anger, when he might have marched back to that church basement and laid the flyer down in front of them, demanding they explain themselves. But he was older now, and he understood too well that this quiet kind of exclusion didn't yield to anger. It thrived in silence. The next morning, James returned to the grocery store. In his hand was a new flyer. He pinned it carefully next to the original, letting the 2 sheets rest side by side. His was simpler. It read, "Community means everyone. If you see something, speak to them, not about them. No red ink, no list of suspicious behaviors. Just that." James stepped back, nodding to himself before walking away. And as he did, he wondered how long the second flyer would stay there. Maybe a day, maybe an hour. But for now, it was enough. The evening air hung heavy over the neighborhood, thick with summer's humidity and something else, something unspoken but felt by everyone. James sat on his front porch, rocking slowly as the sun dipped below the rooftops. The familiar creak of the wooden chair beneath him was the only sound, save for the distant hum of cars along the avenue. A week had passed since he posted the flyer. By now, it was gone. No surprise there. James had found it crumpled near the trash bin outside the grocery store. Rain-soaked and half-torn. Discarded as easily as the idea it carried. But something lingered in the wake of it. A shift. Small, but present. The next day, Sarah from across the street waved first when she saw him. Tom, the mailman, lingered a little longer at his gate, making small talk that stretched just a moment past polite necessity. And now, as James sat watching the fading light, he felt the slow churn of that shift. Like the wheels of a long idle train beginning to turn. The sound of raised voices carried down the block. James leaned forward, peering past the hedges lining his yard. 2 houses down, by the corner where the street lamp flickered, he saw them, Michael and his son, Evan. It wasn't hard to guess what had happened. Michael's shoulders were squared in that tight, defensive way James recognized all too well. Evan's head was bowed, hands jammed into the pockets of his hoodie. A second figure, white, older, with thinning hair and stiff posture, stood opposite them, one hand gesturing sharply toward Evan. James couldn't hear the exact words, but he didn't need to. The posturing said enough. By the time he crossed the lawn, the conversation was loud enough for anyone nearby to catch. "I saw him cutting through the alley," the man was saying, his voice sharp with the kind of certainty that left little room for doubt or decency. "It's not the first time, either." Michael's jaw tightened. "He was coming home. We live right there." "I understand that," the man replied, but his tone betrayed him. His eyes flicked toward Evan, brief, but heavy. James stepped onto the sidewalk, his hands resting lightly at his sides. "Everything all right here?" Michael turned slightly, exhaling through his nose. He didn't speak, but the tension in his stance softened just a touch. The older man stiffened at James's approach. "This is between us." "No," James said calmly. "It's not." The man's gaze lingered on him, hard and searching, before he shifted uncomfortably beneath it. "Kids need to understand," the man muttered, softer now, as if reason could mask the weight of his implication. James let the silence stretch, unflinching beneath the man's stare. Then he spoke, his voice even but edged with steel. "Understanding isn't the problem." Michael's eyes met James's briefly, the gratitude in them wordless but clear. Evan shifted, his shoulders curling inward, as if he hoped to disappear between them. The older man said nothing more. He turned and walked briskly down the street, his back straight but his footsteps hurried. James waited until he had disappeared around the corner before he spoke again. "You good?" he asked Michael quietly. Michael nodded, his hand resting lightly on Evan's shoulder. "Yeah, thanks." Evan glanced up, his eyes flickering with something like relief, something quieter, but no less important. James offered a small nod and began the walk back to his porch. The next morning, James found a new flyer pinned to the board outside the grocery store. Handwritten this time, in Michael's neat script. It read, "Community means looking out for each other. If you see something, ask questions, not assumptions." James stood there for a long while, reading the words over and over, until the weight in his chest felt just a little lighter. And when he left, the flyer stayed exactly where it was.